Yes. Oh, here we are. Now I see myself.
Yeah, we were missing the stage for about a month, right? So I think it's like 28 days since our East Meets West conference, but here we are again. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Pavel. Ludo is next to me. We are the co-founders of East Meets West, and we have a pleasure to welcome you actually on this premiere, the premiere of the Spotlight series. And maybe before we get to the topic of the Spotlight series, which means Open for Business will be telling us about the economical impact of LGBTI, diversity and inclusion. Perhaps a few words at the very beginning. I don't know, Ludo, if you want to start with a bit of what is East Meets West, because I see actually that there are quite some new people. Maybe they don't know what East Meets West stands for.
No, it will be a pleasure. I mean, East Meets West. Some people know it, some people don't know it. It's quite difficult not to know it because we're everywhere. But anyway, we are the two guys you see here are the ones that started East Meets West 7 years ago. At some phases, it's visible at 7 years. Others don't have that problem. They get nicer by aging, but okay, that's a detail. But what do we do? So now I would like to see the slide. Is the slide visible here? Put somewhere the slides. Anyway, I can already say it, and you will see it later on for the slides, that what East Meets West do is an NGO. East Meets West, as you see there, as an NGO. Go away, Schubert, you're in the face of me. Come on, go away. Yes, that's better. Now that's much better. Now you see where we are. You see, in fact, this is in fact our mission, our vision that we have in East Meets West. We want to increase social acceptance of LGBTI people in Central Eastern Europe in a business environment. These four topics are very important. Social acceptance, we focus on LGBTI community. Our home market is Central Eastern Europe. And of course, we focus on a business environment, which is quite unique, I think, in the whole LGBT movement. It's rarely seen. Most of them, they focus on other points. What does it mean for us? Because this is a huge message that we have. So therefore, we focus on certain points. We focus on many things, but to give a few examples, we generally want to educate the people on the economical impact of LGBTI diversity and inclusion. This is something that we want to say, how it's the impact on business, on the whole organization of society, how this has a positive influence. We support also LGBTI business owners to grow and discover opportunities. That means that we are very much focusing on working with businesses, talking to businesses, and we see opportunities within our network. We gladly use this to make them aware of their own power. We also facilitate always business networking. This is something where we always are when we have the chance. We do it constantly. And in fact, there are two things that we also develop little by little now later on. That is, we want to introduce in our network, in our LGBT network, Central Eastern Europe, the concept of supplier diversity. This is a very interesting, very powerful element which we have to explain to everybody because it's quite unknown in Europe. And the last thing we do, and that has been shown to be very efficient, we also put together LGBTI employee resource group of different companies in a country. We put them together and we let them talk to each other. And this is also a very powerful tool that we use to get into this business environment that is clear. Another point is that it's very important also to look at, I think I went too far. Yes, that's better. How do we do this? Well, we have three main activities. We have our LGBTI business events. That is our international LGBT East Meets West conference. We will be in June. And those who had the chance to see us active in June on our first online conference, which was quite an event, they know what it means. It is something that is always original, always innovative. And we always try to find incredible good speakers so that the people not just go there to sit, watch, and drink a coffee, but also get home with ideas and with inspiration. The second thing is we focus on communication to increase this LGBTI business exposure. When we can, we talk to people, we talk on conferences, we write messages, we meet people to tell them, look, LGBTI is more than just inclusion, more than just workplace inclusion. It is also businesses. We have there a powerful tool. We have to focus on this because it helps also to create social acceptance in an environment when you have this business exposure really working. And the last thing, this is something also new, that we also start setting up LGBTI chambers of commerce in our region, simply because a chamber of commerce can connect local businesses and make them stronger. So this is one of the major things we focus on lately. And then I think it's important also today, and the people from Open for Business know this, data are essential. And we don't know so many data about our region. So we put here together data that are not difficult to find, but we put them together simply on statistical data you can find on internet. We excluded Russia because if you put Russian numbers there, it becomes really out of proportion. But about 170 million people live in our region, in the Central East European part of Europe. It means that about 10 million of these people belong to the LGBTI population, which is a lot of people, 10 million. Then we see about the GDP. The GDP is 5.6 trillion. That means that about 94 billion euros are in fact created by an LGBT group, by LGBT businesses. And we have in the total in the region 5.2 million small businesses. That means we have more than 312,000 LGBTI small businesses. This is not small. So therefore we focus on them. And we make clear that they are a power. And we have to develop the power to increase also our social acceptance. And now I give it further to Pavel.
Yes, of course, because we actually have two heads currently. We are the founders of East Meets West, which I think already now is well established in the region, so in the CE. But we also are super proud to be part of a relatively new organization, which is EGLCC. And EGLCC stands for the European LGBTI Chamber of Commerce. And as you see on the map, so we are covering in EGLCC the Central and Eastern Europe. So all of the countries basically from Austria, Czech Republic, Poland eastwards. But we are happy that on board to the EGLCC, it's also Italian. So the GLBC, the Italian Business Chamber, so you know that. We have also Scandinavia. This is through the Scandinavian Chamber of Commerce. And actually also announced last year, we have also the German chamber, GGLBC. And why is this important? Well, important is because we are joining forces and together we are definitely stronger because we will have definitely a much bigger voice. And just to illustrate it a little bit on the numbers, this is actually when you would look the EGLCC potential. So the economical reach of EGLCC, suddenly from this 170 million population, it's 335 million. So suddenly we really talk about super significant region. And even then when you look at GDP, it's not doubling, but actually I think it was like 2 or 1.5 trillion. It's suddenly 8 trillion because we talk about very much economically powerful countries like Germany, like Italy, having on board. Now, there is only one thing what I want to add towards these small businesses, because potentially we are able to tap on almost 1 million of LGBTI-owned businesses. So run by the LGBTI community, owned by LGBTI community. But is this really the reality? Well, at the end, it goes towards this coming out in business, because only when people are coming out, then we can really see that that actually all of the effort which we are doing is paying off. Now, this was a quick introduction for what we do, me and Ludo. Perhaps a couple rules of how the day will be running. Soon we will be handing over to Drew and to George, who will lead you through the rest of the day. But a couple more points. You see, actually, it's notified on the top right corner of the screen that this session is recorded. There is a reason why we record it, because we don't only want to have this as a one-off online event. We want to have it recorded so that we can also produce a podcast and make this available to those who maybe missed this event. So that's number one. Number two, what if you have questions? So if you have questions, you can use the chat. The chat is then on the left down corner. And there you can either type directly a question, but if you also want to actually speak, then simply raise a hand. I mean, ask us to bring you on a stage. What you do not see that actually there is a technical team, and anytime the technical team is able to pick up the request and bring the person also on the stage. Perhaps the last thing, you also see that we are not running this event alone. actually to produce such a things like our conference or even to do this podcast / spotlight series, we needed partnership. So we are not only partnering with the other chambers of commerce, so those who are already established in Europe, but we also got support from several companies, and you see their logos on the right side. So it's Accenture, Johnson & Johnson, Brown-Forman, all-around team, then the Raiffeisen Group, Giggle Music, and a couple more. So I think there we need to also say a certain appreciation and thank you actually for making this possible. And with this note, let's bring the Open for Business team on the stage, please. So can we have Drew? Can we have George?
Yes.
Excellent. Hello.
Welcome.
Hi there.
Hello. Can you hear us okay?
We can hear you very well. So guys, the stage is yours. We will stay, of course. We will look at the Q&As as well, and we'll definitely help you out with facilitating the session. But welcome to the first, the premiere of the Spotlight series of East Meets West. It's
great.
Yeah.
Real quick before we start, could we get Catherine on the stage too?
Oh yes, I forgot.
Thank you.
We should go now. I mean,
technical team will bring Catherine, and can you get us away from the stage, please, guys?
See, we get nervous like this.
Here we go.
There we go. Hi, Catherine.
Great.
All right, wonderful. Well, good. Thank you so much, Pavel and Ludo, for organizing this and having us a second time after the conference last month. We're really happy to be here. Thank you all for joining and participating in the session today. As Pavel and Ludo spoke about earlier, we will be talking about Open for Business, which is the organization we work for. I'll explain that in a few minutes. But we're going to be introducing an exciting new program that we have launching in Central and Eastern Europe that George is actually running for us. And George will introduce himself in a minute. But the purpose of the program is really to build a data-driven economic and business case for LGBT rights in the region, focused specifically on 4 main countries: Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Ukraine. This is what Open for Business does in every region that we work in. But the purpose is to really collect this data, build these data-driven and evidence-based arguments so that civil society leaders, business leaders, and in some cases policymakers as well can use this economic rationale to really push for more LGBT inclusive societies and a more equal region and a more equal world. So excited to talk about that a little bit more in the next few minutes. But first, I want to introduce myself and the team here. So my name is Drew. I am the Global Program Director for Open for Business. What that means is essentially I just oversee the different local influencer programs that we have running around the world. So the one we're going to discuss today in Central and Eastern Europe. We also have one in the Caribbean. We have one in East Africa, headquartered out of Kenya. And hopefully in the next few months, we'll have one in Asia Pacific as well. So really exciting to have these happening all around the world. And I also manage a lot of the research that we do. So Open for Business does a lot of, produces a lot of reports on the economic case for LGBT rights. And we have a lot in our pipeline, which is very exciting. I joined Open for Business just over 4 years ago from McKinsey. They seconded me to Open for Business. They're one of our coalition partners. They thought they were only letting me go for 1 year, and 4 years later, I'm still here. So I don't think they're too pleased about that, but I'm very happy to still be here, which is great. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to the other members of our team. First, and very exciting for Open for Business that she's here with us today, is our brand new and very first executive director, Catherine Dovey, who is based in London. Catherine just started last week, so she's sort of still drinking from the fire hose. But I'll let her say hi and introduce herself.
Can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Oops.
Is it working now?
Yes.
Perfect. Good. That wasn't too complicated. Thanks very much, Drew, for the introduction, and many thanks also to Ludo and Pavel for having us today. As Drew mentioned, I've been in this brand new role of Executive Director at Open for Business for just over a week now, and it's very exciting to be joining the organization at this time. Open for Business, as Drew mentioned, is really focused on research and data to build this strong economic case for LGBT+ inclusion to help complement other movements towards equality. And I'm very excited to be part of this call today, where you will learn a lot about our regional program in Central and Eastern Europe and our other work globally. So many thanks to all of you for joining. All of our work relies heavily on organizations and individuals working in the LGBT+ space. So we're delighted to see so many of you online today and looking forward to a good discussion.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. And now over to George Perlov, who runs our Central and Eastern Europe program in Berlin.
Hi there. I'm George Perlov, as Drew mentioned. You can also tell I'm an American as well, but living in Europe for the last 4.5 years. The first 3 years in Brussels and the last 1.5 years here in Berlin. So I guess I'm continuing to move east. So probably pretty soon I will be living in Central and Eastern Europe by the way things are going, but who knows? I come out of the world of social impact, working with a lot of NGOs and foundations, helping them become better and smarter about the work that they do in research, strategy, planning, evaluation. And I had met John Miller, who's the founder of the organization and the chair of the board, 2 years ago in Brussels when he presented at the European Parliament. And I got so excited when he presented this work because I thought it is so refreshing and new and different, and I think gets away from a lot of the discussions that are typically had around LGBT issues. I said, I'd love to work with you in some way, some shape on this project. And lo and behold, here I am a couple of years later doing it now here out of Berlin. So with that, I will take you to our next slide. And, which I don't see we need to come to our slides, actually. Do we have our slides up? No, not yet. Here we go. Great. There we go. So I think about all the businesses that are part of the network of Open for Business, which you see here. And then we want to get to know a little bit about you. So we have some survey questions. We said that this was going to be interactive, and we're true to our word. So can you bring up the first survey question? And they're easy. Don't worry, they're not very challenging. So the first question is, where do you live? So do you live in an EU country or a non-EU country? And do you see where to vote on your, excuse me.
Looks like we have a good number coming in here.
Okay, great. Keep going. Oh, looks like the EU is winning today. Give it another second. Does everyone else want to vote on this? We're going to close it in 10 seconds. It's an easy question. I think you might know. Nothing really tricky in here. All right, so let's close the poll, and we see that it looks like the majority of people are from the EU countries. Then can we go to the next question? So the next question is getting into who you are and what you do. So are you a business owner, an independent consultant, an employee of a larger company? Are you currently unemployed? Are you a student or something else?
Something else.
Tell us who you are. And we'll give this another minute here. Okay, so it looks like we have a majority of people from larger companies, a few consultants, business owners, and then a few who are something else. So we can talk about that more later, what that means. So let's go to the next question. I guess I finished that, okay. And now we're going to get into how you identify. Do you identify as part of the LGBT community, or do you consider yourself an ally of the community? Give it another minute here. Okay, so it looks like we are a majority of LGBT people, so we can end that question. Okay, and now we get into something a little more interesting, which is really about what's going on in the world today. And that is the fourth question. And we'll have some other questions as we come later into the presentation, just to keep you on your toes. So, obviously, the biggest issue in the world, as we know right now, is the coronavirus pandemic. But what is the biggest challenge facing your business or businesses in your country these days? Is it hiring and keeping talented employees? These are things we've heard from other people. Marketing to build your customer base? Having enough investment and capital to maintain and grow your business? Competition from lower priced companies? Being visible as an LGBT-friendly organization? Being innovative? Obviously, you probably agree with a number of these things, but we're forcing you to one answer for today. It's a pretty simple kind of poll here. But we're curious to hear what we think is what's really on your mind these days. And I know besides coronavirus, which I think is people would like to forget about for a little bit too at some point. All right, so it looks like being visible as an LGBT-friendly organization. That's great. That many people are saying, how do we do that? Being innovative also came up. Having enough investment and capital to maintain and grow your businesses. Hiring and keeping talented employees, followed by marketing to build your customer base. Okay, so I think this is great to hear. I think these are the challenges that most businesses are facing these days. So it's great to hear about that. And let me finish this up, and then we can go back to our presentation. And I'll move it on back to Drew, who's going to give you a little more background about how the organization really works and what the actual work is.
Wonderful. Thanks, George. And thanks everyone for answering those just quick and easy poll questions. We always find it nice to get a feel of who's in the room, especially for a regional program like this. So great to see that. But before we dive into that, I just wanted to give more background on what Open for Business is, why we exist, what we do, the role that we play. So Open for Business, we are a coalition of, I believe, 31 multinational companies right now. I say I believe because we've just had a few new companies join us, which is very exciting. The coalition's purpose, as you can see here, is to improve the legal and social situations of LGBT people around the world by using the influence of the private sector. So it's very much externally focused. And we really sit at the intersection of the businesses that make us up and the societies that they're operating in. So we help our coalition partners think through, smart and responsible strategies that they can take to act in the public sphere on LGBT rights and LGBT inclusion in those societies that they're operating in. How can they engage with local civil society organizations that are leading this work? How can they use their, the different channels of influence that they have at their disposal to really make the case that LGBT rights is not just a social or cultural issue. It really has economic consequences as well. and build on that human rights argument that is made so often. The strategy that we use to accomplish this work is it looks quite simple whenever it's laid out here. In practice, it's obviously much more complicated. But there's three main strands of the strategy. So the first is research. So Open for Business, a lot of what we do, and really the foundation of all of our programs, is based on research. So constructing and promoting the economic and business case for LGBT inclusion. When the coalition launched in 2015, the very first thing that the 14 founding companies of us did was publish our very first report, which essentially synthesized all of the different academic research, research done by the businesses that made us up, different media reports, different interviews with civil society leaders around the world, and created the first framework that really defines what we mean whenever we say the economic and business case. We talk about this in three main categories. So the first category is economic performance, the second is business performance, and the third is individual performance. And what the evidence shows is that in LGBT inclusive societies, all three of these things, economic, business, and individual performance, all improve. And there's a lot of data that backs that up, and we're working to continue to collect more and more data to really strengthen that case even more. Now, under each of these three categories, we have 27 what we call propositions, but essentially individual reasons that lead to that broader case. So, in economic performance, there's evidence that shows that LGBT inclusive societies are better able to attract foreign direct investment. They have higher levels of national productivity. They're more competitive. They have better public health, and a lot of other sort of macroeconomic arguments. And similarly, on the business side, we see a lot of evidence that shows that LGBT inclusive organizations are better at attracting and retaining talent. They're more innovative, more collaborative. Employees are more satisfied and more productive. And there are many, many other reasons that really build up this case. So I encourage you to check out sort of that foundational report. And since then, we've done a lot of work building on top of that. So we've done research in specific countries and regions, from Kenya to Taiwan to Costa Rica, and we're working on very large regional research projects in the Caribbean and Central and Eastern Europe right now. We've done different global reports, the most recent one being LGBT inclusive cities. So why are LGBT inclusive cities more economically competitive, and what are some of the things that go into that? And we have a host of others as well. But really the main purpose is just to continue putting new data and fresh analysis on this economic and business case. Now, we don't just want to create the research that exists in a vacuum, but it does fuel into the other two arrows of our strategy here, global and local. So globally, what we do is we use our research to really catalyze a coherent voice from the senior leadership of our coalition partners, and really put the economic case for LGBT rights on the agenda at different platforms around the world. So, in the past, we've done a lot of work with the Commonwealth, with the UN, with the World Economic Forum, various other platforms as well. But essentially, just thinking through, how can we make sure that in places where LGBT rights are discussed, but maybe the economic case is not well known, how do we put the research on those agendas? And then similarly, in other platforms where maybe business and economic issues are discussed at length, but LGBT inclusion and LGBT rights are not included as one of those, how do we insert LGBT rights into that conversation as well? So really, how do we elevate this conversation around the world? And that really feeds into the third branch of our strategy, which is our local work. And this is really the meat of what we do programmatically. We work to create local networks, sustainable networks of senior business leaders and civil society organizations to really partner together on taking action in the public sphere on LGBT rights in their region, in their country. So we'll talk about that more in depth in in just a minute. Whoops, I went to the wrong direction. But yeah, under each of those three different arrows of our strategy, we have a different program that lines up to them. And I've already talked through most of these, but knowledge and research, again, we do a lot of work on expounding on the economic and business case. The global influencer program is the name that we give for our work putting this research on different global platforms. And then local influencer programs is the name that we give to those longer term on the ground programs that we have running to build those sustainable networks of business leaders and civil society organizations. And the local influencer programs are really what we are going to, I keep going the wrong way, what we're going to focus on most today, because that's exactly what George is leading in Central and Eastern Europe. So with the local influencer program, it's a relatively straightforward theory of change. So, and it really mirrors the strategy that we have at a global level. But essentially, it starts with developing a strong and data-driven economic case for LGBT. Now, I'm sure a lot of people are asking why we spend so much time on the research and bringing data to the conversation. This was really informed by extensive roundtables and interviews that we've had with business leaders and activists all around the world. When Open for Business first started, we facilitated roundtables in 12 countries, from sort of the Caribbean to Kenya to India to Hong Kong and Singapore, just to get a view of where business leaders' heads were at and where they felt that they could play a very productive role. And what we heard in pretty much every country, it was a bit uncanny. But what we heard is that business leaders are lacking two main things. So first, the local data and arguments to make LGBT inclusion and LGBT rights a real business and economic issue, so that they feel like they have a platform and an authority to be speaking on the issue. A lot of the data that existed at the time and still exists really focuses on the United States, focuses on a lot of Western Europe. And so there's a big need to really, expand those arguments and expand that data in some of the other regions of the world. So that's really why we spend so much time focusing on this research part. It's to reframe the conversation. It's to give business leaders a very strong, or to give them a lot of confidence that they can speak on this issue. And it's also to give activists and civil society organizations new data and new arguments to really add a new angle to their advocacy that they're doing in country. The second step in the theory of change is to use that research to build a network of business leaders and civil society organizations. We have learned over the years that sort of one-off roundtables, while they are good to gather information, they don't really do much to lead to sustained change. And so the local influencer programs are multi-year efforts, so that we can really make sure that we have somebody on the ground in that region that the program is focused on, to work day in and day out with the business leaders in the network and the civil society organizations to make sure that they're all connected together. Any roadblocks that are popping up as they try to implement the strategies that they determine as a group and really take action in the public sphere, removing those roadblocks, and essentially just keeping their eye on the prize and what they're supposed to be doing. And then the third step in the strategy is to identify and implement those smart strategies for acting in the public sphere. And we'll talk about sort of, the channels of influence and the different ways that we have worked with companies to act in the public sphere based on their context a little bit later on today. But there's a wide range of things. It doesn't just have to be, sort of like very publicly waving the rainbow flag, although that's great in some contexts. That doesn't really fly in Kenya with our East Africa program. It doesn't have to be directly talking to policymakers if that's a bit too polarized and contentious in a specific country. There's a lot of other ways that companies can use their leverage in society to really make the case for LGBT rights more broadly. So this is this is really the encapsulation of what we mean when we talk about the local influencer program. Now, just to give you two examples of how this has made an impact in the past, one from Kenya and then one from Taiwan. So in Kenya, I've mentioned that a few times, we have our first local influencer program started there, which was sort of a challenging place to start a local influencer program, but we've seen so much benefit from it that it kind of proves the concept in a really cool way. So in Kenya, we first did spent about 8 months working with a local research firm to produce the economic case for LGBT inclusion in Kenya. And we launched it in the country with the National Human Rights Commission, with a few LGBT NGOs, and also with a few of the companies that are in our coalition. And that launch in Nairobi really attracted a lot of attention publicly in mainstream Kenyan media. And what happened was, because we framed LGBT discrimination as an economic issue, and we actually calculated that it costs Kenya up to $1.3 billion per year, which is about 1.7% of their GDP. It really attracted a lot of headlines, and it was very interesting to see, almost in the course of a week, headlines that had just always been about, religion, LGBT rights being, sort of maybe contrary to Kenyan values, and very sort of harsh rhetoric, was being, or headlines were being added to that were talking about the economic cost of it. So there were headlines that were saying, LGBT discrimination costs up to 100 billion Kenyan shillings a year, different firms say. And so, it's a huge headline, and it's a big way of reframing this conversation. So that was a great way to start off the program. And then because of that, we saw an explosion in the number of companies that were interested in joining the network that we've built there. So we started off with 5. We now have 15, which sounds small, but it's still quite a brave act to attend these roundtables in Kenya. So it's very exciting to see, and a lot of the business leaders say that they are now able to come to these roundtables because they're able to really talk about it from a data-driven way. The network in Kenya is currently discussing how they can collectively, in a context-appropriate way, make a public statement that supports the current ongoing decriminalization case that's happening in Kenya. So how can they really say that businesses support equal rights for everyone, inclusion and diversity across the board, inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity and expression, and how can they make that very well known and very prevalent, and begin changing the conversation on that court case? Because for those of you who aren't familiar with what's happening in the country, there has been a case going through the courts to decriminalize same-sex acts. It was ruled on last May, just over a year ago, by the High Court. It was expected to go positively. However, sort of what we've heard after the fact is a lot of the prominent religious leaders in the country had quite a few conversations with justices and then the president of Kenya right before the decision was made, and it went the wrong direction, unfortunately. So they upheld the law, but the LGBT organization that's challenging the law has appealed it, and it's going to be going to the Supreme Court, which is exciting. So we're working to put the business voice in there, so that it can act as a fresh perspective and something to get out of that typical sort of religion and cultural discussion. So that's how this has worked in Kenya. And then another example, a more short-term example in Taiwan. So we worked with the Marriage Equality Coalition of Taiwan starting in last March, a few months before their legislature voted on marriage equality. And we developed a very short 10-page, what we call economic brief on the economic benefits of marriage equality in Taiwan. And about 15 companies, both sort of multinational but also local Taiwanese businesses, signed on to this and made themselves available for interview with a lot of the prominent business newspapers in the country. And there was a lot of attention a lot of light that was shown on sort of both the research, but also the fact that businesses were collectively speaking about this issue. And the activists in Taiwan really used this as leverage as they were having conversations with legislators behind closed doors, but also just publicly. They talked about it a lot. They said that it's opened up a lot of interest from large national Taiwanese companies on what more they can be doing. And they said that it was really key in helping them get a few of the votes over the line in May of 2019 to legalize marriage equality in Taiwan. So sort of a more short-term example, but really a very clear one on how this clear show of business support can really help advance LGBT rights. Now, all of that leads to what we're doing in Central and Eastern Europe, which I will turn over to George now.
Great. And if you have any thoughts or questions about what Drew just explained on the global level, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm having tech guys a little trouble looking at the Q&A. I don't know if that's operating or not, but maybe the chat might be easier to do that. In any case, our Central and Eastern European program, one important thing to say about it is being funded by Google, who most of you know, and also a US-based funder that you may not know called Equality Without Borders. So we have to say thank you to them for supporting this effort, which is really helping us do the research and build the coalition and build the partners on the ground. And what's interesting, we're focusing on 4 countries here: Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Ukraine. So some immediate things you might notice: Hungary, Poland, Romania in the EU, Ukraine not in the EU. Economically, Hungary, Poland, Romania have all been having some great economic results over the last few years. Obviously, the pandemic is hurting us all at the moment. We do believe that these countries, and I think the latest data that we're seeing is that especially Poland is expected to come out of the pandemic with the least impact on its GDP. Romania and Hungary a little less, and then Ukraine has been struggling a little more because there's been ongoing political issues and war with Russia as well. So there are a lot of issues in that country. And on the LGBT side, we see some very striking and very ugly things coming out of Hungary and Poland, especially. Mostly you've heard about the LGBT free zones in Poland that are now covers a third of the countries, third of the communities and counties in Poland, and it really as far as kind of discrimination goes, it's about the worst. And you think back to sort of Nazi era period, it's not that far of what people were doing to the Jews at that time. Hungary, most recently, we've seen a very strong closing of civil society there by the government in Hungary, and most recently they approved a gender recognition law, which basically says that anyone who's transgender, anyone who would like to file to change their gender status is not able to do so and must keep their original gender status. So a lot of very hateful situations in these countries. Romania and Ukraine also facing a lot of bias, discrimination, hate crimes, violence against LGBT people. So we're looking at all of this data that both on the economic side and on the LGBT side, and seeing where we can start to make some interesting correlations and really understand where the opportunity is in these countries to make an argument for greater LGBT inclusion. And we're going to ask you about your input on this in a minute. And similar to countries, to other countries, we're also are going to use our findings to disseminate our report that we will develop. There'll be a regional report and local reports, and we'll be doing that by the end of the year, and then by early next year be reaching out to the media and sharing this with them and on larger audiences. And we're going to, as Drew said, to build out this program on the ground based on the research finding, with regular engagement with our business, CSO, and ideally with government leaders. And I think that's always, in the research I've been doing so far, we're really trying to find some government leaders who are more open to having this kind of discussion with us. It's tending to find that to be pretty hard in these countries, but we're hoping to find those few moments, those few places where we can find opportunities. And as Drew said, we're also looking for a lot of local businesses in these communities that are LGBT owned, LGBT friendly, to align with us, because I think that is really where we see a huge opportunity as well. Obviously, the clout of larger international companies, that many of whom are part of the Open for Business coalition partners, we see really great opportunities there. But I think it's when it comes from the local audiences that's when we start to see real change. So let me go to our next slide, and we come back to some questions for you. So as I mentioned, we have a couple of more questions here, and this is really going to help us understand the propositions, the arguments that we're going to be making. So can we see the next survey question, please? Okay, so here it's again. Now we're going to have to make you think a little bit more, and we're going to push you to look at these. So when we talk to government leaders, what do you think is, of these propositions, do you think is going to be the most important one for them? What do you think is going to get them to be excited more? Is it about being more competitive, being more entrepreneurial and innovative? Is it about attracting higher levels of investment, foreign investment? Is it having higher levels of GDP growth and productivity? Is it attracting new and larger number of tourists? Is it becoming part of global value change, being able to work with these value chains in other countries? Is it about losing residents to brain drain? Or is it about having a better country brand? And I think that's, this idea of reputation is becoming such a big thing these days. Curious about what your thoughts are on this. So we'll give you another few seconds here to vote.
And I think I'll just interject here, George. The reason that we have these as the options, they line up with the propositions that we have in sort of the overall economic and business case that I mentioned earlier. So there's 27 propositions. These are the macroeconomic ones. So there is a lot of research already that backs up these arguments in other parts of the world, and so we're hoping to expound upon them in Central and Eastern Europe.
Okay, so I'm going to end the poll, and
great.
Let's take a look here. So it looks like having higher levels of GDP growth and productivity is our number one choice, followed by being more entrepreneurial and innovative, and being more competitive, and having a better country brand. And that's great, and that really aligns with our thinking so far and the kinds of data that we're going to start looking at. And on that first point, that the highest scoring one here, having higher levels of GDP growth and productivity, we actually have great data to look at here, because we look at country by country the acceptance of LGBT people, and then we can correlate that with GDP growth, and we really see that it is those more successful, larger economies that have the strongest alignment here with acceptance of LGBT people and GDP growth. And I think that's a very strong message that you can show, and when you show countries, where they stack versus others, that I think is eye-opening. And then the next point, being more entrepreneurial and innovative. This has also come up a lot in our conversations as well. We see that, and it sort of relates a little bit to this idea of brain drain, that, by having discrimination against LGBT people in countries and not having a really wide number of very talented people being able to work for your countries, we're going to lose that entrepreneurial and innovative capability for countries. The point about being more competitive, also we've heard, and there's data that we can show about competitiveness across the countries. And then also having a better country brand. We're seeing that a lot more. And we think that issues like we're seeing in Poland and in Hungary now are starting to have negative effects on the brand of the country. That people will be less likely to want to visit these countries and less likely to support them. So really interesting that to get this feedback here. Okay, and then let's move on to our last question, which is about businesses. Okay, so we're thinking now about business leaders in your country. Which of these propositions about business performance do you think is going to be most important for them? Competing for and retaining talented employees, anticipating a broad range of customer needs, being seen as a responsible, purpose-driven company, having better financial results, or being able to serve a growing LGBT customer base? Okay, let's keep the voting going here. Give it another few seconds. All right. So I'm going to end the poll. And here we see, okay, competing for and retaining talented employees, critical to most companies these days. It's really about, and then we hear this from many of the companies that we've already started talking to in the region, that they're, it's very hard to find good employees, and that, it's if we're losing the talent pool from the LGBT audience, we're losing a good, percentage of who these people are, that could be supporting these companies. Being seen as a responsible, purpose-driven company, also very important these days. I think that we were just talking about this with our advisory group the other day, that younger people especially are looking to companies for what they're doing in terms of corporate social responsibility. And they're making their decisions more based on what the company's values are and what their company is about, rather than say, what their salary is. I think young people are definitely, and as we know, overall are going to are much more open to the idea of LGBT inclusion, as we know. And then obviously having better financial results. And I think that, is obviously it's the bottom line for any company, is to be able to show that. And I think the more that we can show that companies that have LGBTI plus inclusion policies are having better financial results. And we have this data from other countries and from around the world. And we'd like to be able to make these arguments here in these countries as well. Any other thoughts on this, Drew?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
So I'm going to close. So we're going to finish and close, and then maybe we'll come back to the presentation. And I think we're back to Drew, who's going to talk a little bit about how we take all this and influence people along the way.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, George, before I do that, I just realized we had a fantastic program advisory board meeting for the region earlier this week. Would you just want to explain what the program advisory board is and maybe what organizations make it up?
Sure.
Yeah.
So the program advisory board is really helping us with people from each of these countries to be our local ears and advisors for the program. And we're working with both NGOs, academics, and corporate people in the field. And I think it's great because there's such a diversity of thinking and experience and exchange. And what we've also heard so often is that I think there's more desire, and especially more recently, more desire from the NGOs, from the LGBT organizations in the field to work with businesses in a meaningful way. And similarly, the corporate members definitely want to work more with local organizations as well, and often don't have the right way to do this. So some of the groups involved include Google, Dow, IKEA, And then some organizations like ILGA Europe, which has been very supportive of us as well, which has a more of a regional support level for us. And then some of the leading LGBT organizations in each of these countries that we're working with. So it's an interesting mix, and we're hoping that we will get a lot of really good feedback and input from them over the course of the next 6 months.
Yeah, for sure. Great. Well, wonderful. So I will go ahead and talk about these sort of channels of influence that I've referenced a few times, and really, just shine a light on our thinking of how companies can act in the public sphere in a responsible and effective way, given their context. So this slide here is essentially the summary of a report that we put out just over a year ago that we did with Deutsche Bank and the UN Free and Equal campaign that we call the Channels of Influence. So essentially, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the UN Standards of Conduct that were launched, many years ago, and just tons of companies have signed on to. For those of you not familiar with the Standards of Conduct, they are 5 broad themes and standards that companies can sign on to uphold and promote LGBT inclusion in the workplace and LGBT rights around the world. So they range from on one end, kind of the most basic and internal steps to the most advanced and external steps that companies should be taking. Anything from prohibiting discrimination in the workplace all the way up to what they call Standard 5, which is that companies should act in the public sphere. And they should use their influence to really advance LGBT rights, which, as we've talked about, is exactly what we aim to do as a coalition with Open for Business. So we did this piece of work that was supported by Deutsche Bank and UN Free and Equal to really just enumerate the different ways that companies could act in the public sphere. Because what we were hearing a lot of the time was companies really wanted to act publicly and to make it clear that they support LGBT inclusion and LGBT rights, but they were hesitant to do so because they felt like maybe they would be the only ones taking action, or they felt like they would be exposing themselves or their brand too much, given the context of the country that they lived in. And so we wanted to really widen out that conversation and provide many more examples of what companies can be doing to act in the public sphere that, that maybe don't put the individuals or the companies at risk, especially in some of the more challenging regions. So we produced this report by doing a few things. So we did a big survey of existing literature and existing examples of how companies have taken action on a wide range of social issues. Social and environmental issues, I should say. So we looked at how companies have been acting in the public sphere on climate change, what they've been doing, how companies have been taking action on gender equality, racial equality, socioeconomic equality, how they've been dealing with workers' rights in their supply chains around the world. And we learned from these different examples. Now, the reason that we had to do that was, unfortunately, there's not a lot of examples of companies taking explicit action in the public sphere for LGBT rights in some of the more challenging regions of the world. So there's a good number of examples in the U.S. There's a good number and a growing number of examples in Europe, a few in Asia Pacific now that have happened after we've written this report. But at the time, there really weren't too many. So we wanted to learn from other areas as well. And then we interviewed, we worked with Outright Action International as well. And we interviewed, LGBT activists from all around the world to really understand how companies acting in the public sphere could help progress their work. And so we really tried to dig into, exactly how these different channels could be helpful. And by doing this process, we identified these 5 different channels of influence that we call them. So you can see them here in front of you. They're the value chain channel, financial channel, public policy channel, civil society channel, and industry channel. Now, I could spend a whole 2-hour session talking about each of these channels and the different best practices and stakeholders that are involved and the different case studies that have happened in each of them. But for right now, I'll just give a very quick overview. And I just sent a link to our reports in the chat. So you can find this report on that part of our webpage, and you can read through it more. It's quite lengthy and it's very dense, which is good because it gives a lot of backup. So just starting with the value chain channel, this is essentially saying that companies can use their supply chain and distribution networks and really all of the different consumers, suppliers, distributors that they touch to make it clear that LGBT inclusion is a necessity to do business with them and is a core part of their business. So this is things like setting up supplier codes of conduct that explicitly prohibit discrimination against sexual orientation and gender identity, and then actually backing that up with audits, training supply chain auditors to make sure that the largest suppliers in the supply chain are upholding these commitments that they've come to. This is something that the leading companies on climate change have gotten really good at, especially IKEA has sort of has really paved the way on doing this with climate change, and also with workers' rights in the supply chain. So there's been a lot of audits done on different factories around the world, led by Adidas, Nike, a lot of those, Inditex, a lot of those companies that have massive supply chains. So we really learned from them to figure out how that could happen with LGBT rights as well. There's other aspects here as well, such as, promoting to consumers that positive images of LGBT individuals. So inclusive advertising, which, has been happening with more frequency in Brazil. Natura, which is a cosmetics and beauty brand, has been doing just extensive advertisements with trans women and showing them using their products, which is really fantastic. There are brands in the Philippines that have started doing LGBT inclusive advertisements. There's a growing number of examples in the US and Europe as well. So in the value chain channel, there's a lot of different touch points there. Now, moving on to the financial channel, this includes sort of two main things. So a company using its financial leverage to make it clear that LGBT inclusion and LGBT rights is an important consideration whenever they're making business decisions. But it's also working with financial partners, so almost like across their financial supply chain, you could think about it. And specifically in working with local banking partners to make sure that they are LGBT, or that they don't discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity or expression as well. And the reason that this is helpful is, so let's say we're thinking about a massive multinational company that's doing business in, we can use Kenya as an example, and is mandated to use a local Kenyan bank to secure lines of credit and capital and all of that. So they have that strong relationship with that Kenyan bank. Now, what we've heard from LGBT activists in a lot of these countries is that they have a hard time setting up bank accounts for their organizations because these banks see that, their organizations focus on LGBT inclusion or LGBT rights or something like that, and they just refuse to do business with them. And so the theory here is that companies can use their leverage with those banks to say, we won't bring you our business unless, we see that you're not discriminating against different groups because of what they do, including promoting LGBT inclusion. And then the other aspect of this is really like making investment decisions. So, factoring LGBT inclusion into the complete list of criteria that companies are using as they're looking to expand operations, start new operations, etc. There's in the U.S. there's a lot of examples around this with transgender with state laws that have impinged on transgender rights. In North Carolina, Indiana, Georgia. A lot of different places. So it can be a really powerful tool as well. The public policy channel, I think, is the most straightforward. And this is the one that sort of comes to people's minds most readily. but it's leveraging relationships with public officials, governments, politicians, policymakers, using the using the platforms a lot of business leaders have, sitting on advisory boards to government on different things to raise LGBT inclusion, but also working with relevant industry legislators and national human rights institutions. So those are two that are usually not thought about in the public policy channel. But really engaging with, let's say, the the auditing regulators to figure out how LGBT inclusion can be established into their criteria, etc. And then with national human rights institutions, for those who haven't heard of NHRIs, they are typically parts of the legislature in a lot of countries around the world. I want to say 80 countries have NHRI, and they function as human rights watchdogs. So they are supposed to hold the government accountable for their human rights violations, sort of provide structure for how the government should uphold human rights, and a lot of times they are champions for LGBT rights, even in extremely challenging countries like Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya. The NHRIs there all deal with LGBT rights in some sort of way, and their mandate is really, or it's really possible to build on their mandate if businesses are sort of working with them to say that as they come out with business and human rights guidance, LGBT rights and LGBT inclusion should be included there. So, just another kind of angle to put this on the table. The fourth then is the civil society channel. And this is one that, companies in every single country should be doing, in my opinion, but really thinking about how to engage directly with civil society groups and lend them, whether it be financial resources, in-kind expertise, whether it's just meeting space, which is a big problem for NGOs in a lot of countries. But really thinking about how to engage with civil society in a way that uses the company's resources to really build on their work. But we've also included media in civil society channel as well. And we have a few case studies in the report that talks about both in sort of social media policies that companies have and in traditional media training that they give to their employees, but also that they use to really represent their company externally, to factor in talking points on LGBT inclusion and why diversity and inclusion is a key part of their companies. There's a lot that can be done through the media channel there. And then last but not least is really the industry channel. So this is, thinking about professional bodies or industry associations that businesses can work with, most frequently in the form of chambers of commerce. So thinking about, like large national chambers of commerce, which are, notoriously conservative, I think, in a lot of different countries. But if they are speaking on an issue, it truly becomes a core private sector wide issue. And it doesn't just look like a few, maybe a few multinational companies talking about something. It becomes, very mainstream, and gains a lot of momentum in that way. So this is something that, the network in Kenya is really focused on. How do you get the largest Kenyan chamber of commerce on board and speaking about this? And it's really been the case in other places. In Japan, there's a really interesting example. A lot of the foreign chambers of commerce, so, the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan, the British Chamber of Commerce in Japan, have co-authored a viewpoint on marriage equality. So essentially just laying out why they support marriage equality from a business lens, which has led a lot of other companies to sign on to it as well, which is very cool. So they can really use their voices in a big and unique way. As I said, I could go on about this for hours, but I'll stop there, and happy to answer any questions. But really encourage you to check out the report. And I'm just remembering, Pavel and Ludo were huge helps as we were putting this together as well. They gave us their time for interviews and all of that, which was very helpful. So big shout out.
Great. Drew, there's a couple of questions here. One is from someone, Sarah Winkler, who says, how would you exactly define LGBT plus business? I don't know if you would like to respond to that or.
Sure. So that's a good question. We typically don't work with LGBT, or we don't work exclusively with LGBT businesses. So I'm not sure we really, strictly work with that term and define it outright. But I can just talk about sort of the the different areas that we do work and that could come into play. So LGBT businesses, the work that East Meets West does, the work that all of the different chambers of commerce listed on the side do, the National LGBT Chamber of Commerce in the United States, they certify companies as being majority LGBT owned and operated. So I think like 51% of the leadership has to be or has to identify as LGBT. And then they're certified as an LGBT-owned business. It might be different in different countries and different chambers, but I know that's how the one in the United States does it. We think about, we sort of think about LGBT inclusion and business as a separate group. So you have LGBT-owned and operated businesses, which is a really key constituency. But then we think about, multinationals, which are unfortunately not owned by LGBT people or run by LGBT people in the majority. We think about multinationals sort of using their leverage to make the case for more LGBT inclusion. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks. And then Ludo was asking, did the development of CSR, corporate social responsibility, in the business world make your work easier? Well, I'll sort of jump in on that. I mean, I do think that, yes, I think companies are looking at a lot of things that are part of a social responsibility program. It's about people, it's about the planet, it's about the environment. It's so many different areas that companies are being asked to look at. And I think, we realize that there's a lot that's on the minds of CSR leaders in companies, but we really want to keep making the case about the diversity and inclusion of LGBT and the inclusion of LGBT people, because it can be easily forgotten, and it's just, and not to say it's more important than the issue of, women in the workforce, people with disabilities, people of ethnic minorities. We think all of that is super important. And we work together with a lot of these groups to say, to collectively say that all of this is really important for a business to be successful. You have to be able to show that you are responsible to the people in your community, to the environment in your community as well. So that's, I think, maybe our short answer on that. I don't know, Drew, if you have any other thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, so just sort of a comment on CSR as a whole. I think the popularization of CSR has really helped our work, but just helped sort of the entire, I don't want to call it industry, but like the entire movement of getting companies more involved in LGBT rights issues greatly. I think the risk of CSR is, so some companies do it really well, but some companies just sort of like bolt it on as almost like an afterthought to their core operations. And it's like, we have to have CSR because it's expected of us. So, we'll give them a little bit of budget and they'll do their thing. Now, it's not all companies, but I would say the majority of companies do it like that. There's now almost an evolution that's moving more toward, you can call it shared value or business and human rights. There's different terms for it, but it's really kind of this push to integrate the issues that CSR deals with. So, human rights issues, environmental issues, governance issues, and integrating them into really the core operations of what that company is about. So that, they're making these decisions as they're making decisions about their business, and it gets more visibility and more attention paid to it. So I think the trend is really merging those two things together. I think right now, they're still quite separate, which is not ideal. But we have to keep pushing, companies to really make this central to their operations.
Thanks, Drew. Great. So we have just a few more minutes left. I have one more slide to share with you about how you can get involved. But please put any other questions or thoughts you have in the chat, and we can answer them in the next few minutes. So how can you get involved? So think about it. If there are business leaders, policymakers, civil society leaders, or other key opinion leaders in our 4 target countries that you think we should know, that you have connections to, please feel free to make an introduction for us. We'd love to talk to them. Also, just stay connected, especially if you are in these countries. You can email me at that address, or you can get in touch through the Open for Business website, which is open-for-business.org. Connect with us on LinkedIn through Open for Business, LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. We'll post updates there regularly. And any other ideas you have? It's great to know, who our allies are in the region. So it's just really good to know who's out there, who's doing what. And we'd love to hear from you and stay in touch. So collectively, we can build a more diverse and inclusive environment for the LGBT community in Central and Eastern Europe. So I think that's basically our last slide. And again, here's the ways you can get in touch on social media. So any other questions? I
see one.
Yeah,
one from Sarah on saying more about plans for Asia Pacific, which I'm happy to take. So essentially we want to start a similar program in Asia Pacific, mainly focusing on ASEAN, so those Southeast Asian nations, because Asia Pacific is massive. We have done a lot of sort of network building and executive dialogues in the region. So Japan, Korea, Philippines, Singapore, Hong Kong, we've done a lot of work in. And right now we're doing a sort of strategy exercise. So we're interviewing business leaders from those countries, but also Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, to really get business leaders and civil society organizations, to really get their views on what the best way to construct the program would be, so that we can strike the proper balance of it being regional and sort of, all of the network benefits that come from that, but also being sort of localized enough, because it's just such a crazy diverse region that we have to be really careful about how we structure it. So we're in the plans for that, and then there's a lot of fundraising that comes with that as well. So we're in the process of doing that too.
Great. Okay. Any other last questions or thoughts? As I said, we're really excited about this program, and we're excited to get it off the ground. So you'll hear more from us over time, and we'll keep you posted. Drew, any last thoughts?
No, I don't think so. Thank you all for joining, and a huge thank you again to Pavel and Ludo for putting this together and just being wonderful friends to Open for Business over the years.
Right, and I think we will be sharing all of these slides and the poll results as well. Right, Pavel and Ludo? I'll let you guys come back and answer that. So there they are again. Here's our host.
Yes, I'm back.
Back on the stage.
Guys, great work.
Yeah, here we are, yes.
we know your work already for some time, for a couple of years, but you always surprise us with something new. And so from my side, great compliment. Ludo, what do you think?
I put in when I was listening to all the information, I put down some key messages. First of all, I'm very happy that you're going to our region. It's a very tough region also for us. We worked with it now for 7 years. It got better. Now it got once again challenging. But I think it's very important that you show also that you take that part with you. I put here also that data is power, and we see that also. The more you put the data in and you have the data, and we were very poor with data, it makes us stronger. I put here also, I'm a little bit older than Pavel. In the time when we started thinking about these things and we got some responses, it was mainly based on on sympathy, or it is nice. We were always holding the hand and please help us, that kind of feeling. Because it was fashionable to support our. Now, if you look at what you're doing, this is now becoming much more based on data, which means that it becomes stronger. It becomes about money. And if you talk to businesses, money is everything. And then they do no longer ask the question why we do it. They say now, how do we do it? It's a huge difference in how you're working with this. There are challenges, like Drew said, about this social responsibility. It's true, there are always people that profit from it, but I think we feel much stronger when we base it on data. And what you're doing now in our region is essential. You are pioneers, to use a word from that old time in that region. Pioneers were there, you're back there,
Yeah.
And we know feeling how to be pioneers, so join the force. But it's really very refreshing, and also for us very motivating to have this supporting us what we do. Yeah. So thank you very much also what you said and also what you're doing.
Fantastic.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks
Thank
for the
you.
work.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, guys, for joining us for this premiere. For all of the participants, as we said, so there will be follow-ups. We'll be sharing the slides. We'll be also sharing the video recording, and this will be also posted on our channel, so that we can kind of help open for business to spread the message and
Absolutely.
get you actually as many interested partners as possible in the region.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure there will be some. There will be.
Wonderful.
Excellent.
Thanks so much.
Terrific. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
guys.
Bye-bye.
Have a great
Have a good afternoon and weekend.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice
Bye.
day. Yes, bye-bye.